Chapter 5. Mr. Collins proposes twice. At Longbourn the next day, soon after breakfast, Mr. Collins asked Mrs. Bennet for permission to speak privately to Elizabeth. Mrs. Bennet was delighted, and hurried the other girls out of the room, so that Elizabeth and Mr. Collins were left alone together. Elizabeth did not want to stay, and got up to leave, but after a moment's thought, sat down again quietly, determined to listen and reply politely.
"My dear Miss Elizabeth," said Mr. Collins seriously, "this little unwillingness to hear me, this modesty of yours, can only add to your other charms. You can hardly doubt the purpose of my speech. Almost as soon as I entered the house, I chose you as the companion of my future life. But before I am carried away by my feelings, I think I should state my reasons for marrying."
Elizabeth was trying so hard not to laugh at the idea of Mr. Collins being carried away by his feelings that she was unable to reply.
"First," he continued, "it is right for a priest to marry, as an example to other people. Secondly, I'm sure marriage will add greatly to my happiness. And thirdly, which perhaps I should have mentioned earlier, my generous patron has advised me to marry. Find an active, useful sort of person, she told me, a woman who can make a small income go a long way. Bring her to Hunsford as your wife, and I'll visit her. So I decided to choose a wife from among my Bennet cousins to lessen the loss to the family when the sad event of your father's death takes place. I flatter myself that you will appreciate my motives. And now nothing remains but to convince you of the violence of my affection. I am quite indifferent to the fact that you bring little money with you into our marriage, and promise you that I shall make no ungenerous reference to this after we are married."
It was absolutely necessary to interrupt him now. "Sir, you forget I have given no answer. Accept my thanks for the compliment you are paying me, but it is impossible for me to accept your proposal."
"Of course I understand," said Mr. Collins, "that young ladies often do not accept a proposal of marriage the first time. I am therefore not at all discouraged, and sincerely hope we shall be married soon."
"Sir," cried Elizabeth, "your hope is rather extraordinary after what I've said. I am perfectly serious. You could not make me happy, and I'm convinced I'm the last woman in the world who would make you happy. And I'm sure that if Lady Catherine knew me, she would find me poorly qualified for the situation."
"If I knew Lady Catherine thought so," began Mr. Collins, looking very worried, "but I cannot imagine she would disapprove of you, and when I have the honour of seeing her again, I shall certainly tell her how modest, economical, and practical you are."
"Indeed, Mr. Collins, all praise of me will be unnecessary. Pay me the compliment of believing what I say. I hope you will be very happy and very rich, but I cannot accept your proposal." She got up and was going to leave the room, but Mr. Collins was speaking to her again.
"I am far from accusing you of cruelty in refusing me, as I know it is the custom with elegant ladies in society to refuse a gentleman the first time. I hope to receive a more favourable answer next time I speak to you of marriage."
"Really, Mr. Collins," cried Elizabeth with some warmth, "you do puzzle me. I do not know how to express my refusal so that it convinces you."
"You must allow me to flatter myself, dear cousin, that you do not intend to refuse me for long. My situation in life, my connections with the de Burgh family, and my relationship to your own all make my proposal a very suitable one. And you should remember that in spite of your many admirable qualities, it is not certain that you will receive any other offer of marriage, as you have very little money of your own."
"Sir, thank you again for the honour you have done me, but to accept your proposal is absolutely impossible. Can I speak plainer than that? Don't think of me as an elegant female, but as a thinking creature speaking the truth from her heart."
"You are charming," he cried, "and I'm sure that when both your excellent parents agree, you will accept my proposal."
Elizabeth did not reply, but left the room silently, determined to ask her father, if necessary, to make her refusal clear to the self-deceiving Mr. Collins. Mrs. Bennet had been waiting eagerly for the end of the interview, and when she saw Elizabeth leave the room, she hurried in to offer her congratulations to Mr. Collins. He received them with pleasure, adding that he was sure his cousin's refusal was a natural result of her modesty and delicacy of character.
"Refusal?" repeated Mrs. Bennet, shocked. "Lizzie refused you? Do not worry, Mr. Collins. I shall speak to her at once. She's a very obstinate, foolish girl, but I'll make her accept you." "Pardon me, madam," cried Mr. Collins, "but if she's really obstinate and foolish, I do not think she would be a suitable wife for a man in my situation." "Sir, you quite misunderstand me," said Mrs. Bennet, alarmed. "She's only obstinate in a matter like this. In everything else she is very agreeable. I'll see Mr. Bennet, and we'll arrange it with her, I'm sure."
She did not give him time to reply, but hurried to the library, where she knew she would find her husband.
"Oh, Mr. Bennet, we need you urgently. We're all in such confusion. You must come and make Lizzie marry Mr. Collins."
Mr. Bennet raised his eyes from his book as she entered, and stared at her with calm unconcern.
"I do not have the pleasure of understanding you," he said. "What are you talking about?" "Lizzie declares she won't have him, and if you don't hurry, he'll change his mind and not have her."
"So what should I do? It seems a hopeless business."
"Speak to her about it yourself. Tell her you insist on her marrying him."
"Call her in here. She shall hear my opinion." Mrs. Bennet gladly rang the bell, and the servant brought Elizabeth into the library.
"Come here, child," said her father as she appeared. "I've sent for you on a very important matter. I understand that Mr. Collins has made you an offer of marriage, and you have refused."
When Elizabeth nodded, he continued,
"Very well. Now, your mother insists on your accepting. Isn't that right, Mrs. Bennet?" "Yes, or I'll never see her again." "You now have an unhappy choice to make, Elizabeth. From this day on, you must be a stranger to one of your parents. Your mother will never see you again if you do not marry Mr. Collins, and I will never see you again if you do."
Elizabeth could not help smiling, but Mrs. Bennet, who had been sure her husband supported her, was very disappointed.
"What do you mean, Mr. Bennet? You promised me you would insist on her marrying him."
"My dear," replied her husband, "I have two small requests to make. First, that you will accept that I know what I promised or did not promise, and secondly, that you will all leave me in peace as soon as possible." That afternoon, Charlotte Lucas came to visit Elizabeth and found the family still in great confusion. The younger girls were quite excited by the news of Mr. Collins' proposal, and Mrs. Bennet was most annoyed with Elizabeth.
"Oh, dear Miss Lucas," cried Mrs. Bennet, "can't you persuade Elizabeth to accept Mr. Collins? Nobody else wants to help me. Oh, how ill I feel. And look at Lizzie now. She's so unconcerned. But I tell you, Miss Lizzie, if you go on refusing every offer of marriage like this, you'll never get a husband at all, and I won't be able to provide for you when your father is dead. I warn you now. I told you in the library that I wouldn't speak to you again, and I won't. I have no pleasure in talking to an undutiful child like you. Not that I have much pleasure in talking to anybody with my headaches. Nobody knows how I suffer. But of course, those who do not complain are never pitied."
Her daughters listened in silence, aware that any attempt to calm her would only increase her annoyance. Elizabeth, however, was determined not to marry Mr. Collins, and in the end Mrs. Bennet was obliged to accept that fact. When Mr. Collins realised that Elizabeth had meant what she said, his manner towards her became coldly and stiffly polite. His long speeches and flattering compliments were transferred for the rest of the day to kind Charlotte Lucas, who took on herself the trouble of listening to him, for which all the Bennets were very grateful. The next day, a letter was delivered to Jane from Netherfield. Elizabeth saw her sister's expression change as she read it, and when they were alone she asked about it.
"It's from Caroline Bingley," said Jane, "and it has surprised me very much. The whole party have left Netherfield and are on their way back to London, probably for the winter. They may not return to Netherfield at all. She says the only thing she sincerely regrets is leaving me behind in Hertfordshire, and promises to write very frequently."
Elizabeth did not trust Miss Bingley's apparent affection for Jane. "I really don't think their departure matters very much," she said. "Mr. Bingley won't be kept in London by his sisters. I'm sure he'll be back at Netherfield soon."
"But perhaps he prefers to stay in London, where many of his friends are. But I haven't told you everything yet. Let me read you the part which particularly hurts me. Mr. Darcy is impatient to see his sister, and we confess we are also eager to see her again. Nobody is more beautiful, elegant, or accomplished than Georgiana Darcy. Louisa and I have great affection for her, and hope one day to call her sister. My brother admires her very much. He will have frequent opportunities of seeing her, and although I am his sister, I must say I think he is most capable of winning any woman's heart. What do you think of this, dear Lizzie? Isn't it clear enough? Caroline doesn't wish or expect me to become her sister-in-law. She's convinced of her brother's indifference towards me, and perhaps because she suspects my feelings for him, she, most kindly, warns me that he's very likely to marry someone else."
"I have a totally different opinion. Miss Bingley sees her brother is in love with you, while she wants him to marry Miss Darcy. We aren't rich enough or grand enough for them, and she is eager to have a family connection with the Darcys, so that it may be easier for her to marry Mr. Darcy. So she follows her brother to London, hoping to keep him there, and tries to persuade you he doesn't care about you. But of course he's in love with you."
"I really can't agree with you about Caroline. I think she's incapable of deceiving anyone. But Lizzie, my dear sister, even if she's wrong about her brother, and he does care for me, could I be happy in accepting a man whose sisters and friends all wish him to marry someone else?"
"You must decide for yourself, and if you consider it more important to do what his sisters want than to gain the happiness of being his wife, I certainly advise you to refuse him."
"How can you say that?" said Jane, smiling a little. "You know I wouldn't hesitate, although I'd be sad if they disapproved of me. But, oh dear, if he doesn't come back to Netherfield, I'll never have to make the decision."
But Elizabeth was sure Mr. Bingley could not be kept away from Jane by his sisters, and soon persuaded Jane to take a more hopeful view of the situation. That day, the Bennets, with Mr. Collins, went to dinner with the Lucas family at Lucas Lodge. Again it was Charlotte who spent most of the evening listening to Mr. Collins. Elizabeth was very relieved, and thanked her friend gratefully for the trouble she was taking. But Charlotte's kindness had a particular aim which Elizabeth was unaware of. Her plan was to encourage Mr. Collins to transfer his attentions to herself. In fact, she was managing so well that when she said good-night to him after dinner, she would have felt sure of success if he had been staying in Hertfordshire for another week. But she did not fully appreciate the fire and independence of his character, which caused him to get up very early the next morning and escape from Longbourn House in a great hurry to reach Lucas Lodge and throw himself at her feet. She did not keep him waiting for an answer, and the happy couple found themselves engaged as quickly as Mr. Collins' long speeches would allow. Charlotte's parents were delighted to agree to the marriage, and Lady Lucas began to work out, with more interest than she had ever felt before, how many more years Mr. Bennet was likely to live. Charlotte herself was quite satisfied. Mr. Collins certainly was neither sensible nor agreeable, but still he would be a husband. She did not think highly of men or of marriage, but she had always intended to marry. Although marriage might not always bring happiness, it was the only honourable way in which a well-educated woman with little income could provide a home for herself. Now 27 and lacking beauty, she felt she was lucky to have found a husband. She knew, however, that Elizabeth, whose friendship she greatly valued, would be astonished and possibly disapproving. So she decided to go to Longbourn House to tell her friend the news herself. Elizabeth was indeed shocked at first, and could not help crying out in surprise. But when Charlotte explained her reasons for accepting Mr. Collins, Elizabeth tried hard to understand. When the rest of the Bennet family heard the news, they were also astonished. Mrs. Bennet was quite horrified, and could not stop complaining bitterly about Charlotte's wickedness, Mr. Collins' stupidity, and Elizabeth's obstinacy. Mr. Bennet was much calmer, only saying he was pleased to discover that Charlotte, whom he used to consider quite sensible, was as foolish as his wife, and more foolish than his daughter. That day was Mr. Collins' last at Longbourn, and he left with many speeches of thanks, as well as a promise to return very soon. Mr. Bennet warned him to be careful not to offend his patron by being absent from his duties too often. But Mr. Collins, although extremely grateful for this sign of Mr. Bennet's cousinly affection for him, was naturally eager to return to Hertfordshire to see his future wife. Only 2 weeks later he did in fact come back to stay at Longbourn, but spent most of his time at Lucas Lodge, making arrangements for the wedding. Mrs. Bennet still felt very offended by him, but she was now becoming anxious about something even more important: Mr. Bingley's continued absence. Day after day had passed with no news since the arrival of Caroline Bingley's letter. Elizabeth was now rather worried, and Jane feared the worst. Finally, a second letter arrived from Caroline Bingley, and when Jane read it, she realised that all hope was over. The Bingley family was staying in London for the whole winter, and Georgiana Darcy was a frequent member of their circle. Miss Bingley boasted joyfully of this friendship, and looked forward to her brother's probable marriage to Miss Darcy. Although she was deeply upset, Jane bravely tried to control her feelings.
"Do not worry, Lizzie. I shall be able to forget him in a while. I have nothing to complain of, as he made no promises to me. I just thought he cared for me, but I was wrong. Luckily no one is hurt except myself."
"My dear Jane," said Elizabeth, "you are too good. You always think the best of everybody. Now I think the worst of most people, and do not see much real value or common sense around me. Mr. Bingley, for example. He may not be intending to hurt you, but misery can be caused by someone being just weak and indecisive. I'm convinced his sisters and his friend Mr. Darcy are trying to influence him against you. Another example is Charlotte. I can't understand how she could agree to marry such a self-important, proud, silly man."
"Dear Lizzie," said Jane, "we must respect Charlotte's decision. She may well be happy with Mr. Collins. And as for Mr. Bingley, we shouldn't expect a sociable young man to be so careful of his behaviour. Women often imagine admiration means more than it really does.
And men want that to happen."
"I prefer to believe that I was mistaken in thinking he cared for me, and that his sisters love him and approve of his wish to marry Miss Darcy. I don't want to think badly of him or his sisters. That would be worse than anything."
Elizabeth had to accept Jane's wishes, and from then on, Mr. Bingley's name was seldom mentioned between them. Chapter 6. Elizabeth visits Mr. and Mrs. Collins. The following Monday, Mrs. Bennet had the pleasure of receiving her brother and his wife, who came, as usual, to spend Christmas at Longbourn. Mr. Gardiner was a sensible, gentlemanlike man. The Netherfield ladies would have had difficulty in believing that a man who lived by buying and selling could be so well-mannered and agreeable. Mrs. Gardiner, who was several years younger than Mrs. Bennet and Mrs. Phillips, was a pleasant, intelligent, elegant woman, and a great favourite with her Longbourn nieces, especially the two eldest, who often stayed with her in London. When Mrs. Gardiner had given the present she had brought with her and described the newest fashions, she was obliged to listen to Mrs. Bennet's complaints. "I've suffered greatly since your last visit, sister," cried Mrs. Bennet. "Just imagine! 2 of my daughters were very close to marriage, and then nothing. I do not blame Jane, who would have got Mr. Bingley if she could. But Lizzie, oh, sister, it is hard to think she might have been Mrs. Collins by now if she hadn't been so obstinate. The result is that Lady Lucas will have a daughter married before me. It makes me quite ill to have such a disobedient daughter and such selfish neighbours. But your coming just now is a great comfort to me, and I am very glad to hear what you tell us about long sleeves." Mrs. Gardiner made a suitably sympathetic reply to her sister-in-law, and later that day found the opportunity to discuss the matter in more detail with Elizabeth alone. "I am sorry for Jane," she said kindly, "but Lizzie, these things happen so often. A young man like Mr. Bingley frequently falls in love with a pretty girl, and when chance separates them, he forgets her very quickly." "Yes, Aunt," said Elizabeth, "but in this case it was not chance, but the young man's interfering friends who separated Jane and Mr. Bingley. I'm sure he was violently in love with her." "Poor Jane. She's so sensitive." "I'm afraid she may not get over it for some time." "Now, if it had been you, Lizzie, you would have recovered more quickly by finding humour in the situation. But do you think I could persuade Jane to come back with us to London? Perhaps a change of air would make her feel better." Elizabeth was extremely grateful to her aunt for this kind suggestion, and felt sure Jane would gladly agree. "I hope," added Mrs. Gardiner, "that she will not be influenced by the hope of seeing the young man. We live in such a different part of town that it is very unlikely they will meet, unless he actually comes to see her. And that is quite impossible, because his friend Mr. Darcy would not allow him to visit so unfashionable an address." But despite her protest, Elizabeth secretly thought that Jane might see Bingley in London, and that a meeting would probably reawaken his affection for her. The Gardiners stayed at Longbourn for a week, and Mrs. Bennet made sure there was always some entertainment for her brother and sister-in-law. Whenever there was a dinner party at Longbourn House, some of the officers were always invited. Mrs. Gardiner, who had noticed that Mr. Wickham was a very frequent visitor and that Elizabeth spoke admiringly of him, took care to observe them both. She saw enough to make her a little anxious, and decided to speak to Elizabeth about him when they were alone. "Lizzie," she began, "I can see that you and Mr. Wickham like each other, but I must warn you not to get seriously involved with him. I admit he's a most interesting young man, but sadly he has no fortune. You are a sensible girl, and must realise that you would disappoint your father by agreeing to marry a penniless young man." "My dear aunt, do not worry. I'll take care of myself, and Mr. Wickham too. He won't be in love with me if I can prevent it." "Elizabeth, be serious." "I'm sorry, aunt. I'll try again. At present, I'm certainly not in love with him, but he is by far the most agreeable man I've ever met. And if he really loved me— but I would hate to disappoint my father or make any of you unhappy. I cannot promise what I will do, but I will really try to do what I think is wisest. I hope you are satisfied with that." Her aunt replied that she was, and received Elizabeth's thanks for her kind advice. Several days after this, the Gardiners returned to London, taking Jane with them. The day of Mr. Collins' wedding soon arrived, and Mrs. Bennet had to watch Charlotte Lucas become Mrs. Collins. Before the bride left Longbourn for Hunsford, however, she asked Elizabeth to come and visit her in her new home as soon as possible. Elizabeth could not refuse, although she did not imagine it would be an enjoyable visit. It was arranged that Elizabeth would accompany Sir William Lucas and Maria, one of his other daughters, on their intended visit to Hunsford in March. A week after Jane's departure, Elizabeth received a letter from her sister saying that she had seen Miss Bingley and hoped to continue their friendship. Elizabeth shook her head over this. She was not surprised to hear from Jane a few weeks later that Caroline Bingley had made no further attempts to communicate with her former dear friend. Elizabeth was saddened to read of Jane's disappointment, but felt more cheerful when she told herself that Jane would no longer be deceived, by the sister at least. All expectation from the brother was now absolutely over. As a punishment for him, she seriously hoped he would soon marry Mr. Darcy's sister, who, according to Wickham, would make him quickly regret what he had thrown away. At about this time, Elizabeth also received a letter from Mrs. Gardiner asking about Wickham, and she was able to reply quite honestly that there was no danger of her marrying him. He had transferred his affections to a Miss King, who had recently inherited £10,000. Elizabeth saw exactly what was happening, but her heart had only been slightly touched, and she was able to convince herself that it was quite natural for such an agreeable young man to wish for fortune and independence. January and February passed, and the time for Elizabeth's visit to Mr. and Mrs. Collins approached. She had improved the plan by arranging to spend a night in London at her uncle and aunt's house before continuing the journey into Kent. She was very much looking forward to seeing Jane, who was still staying with the Gardiners. The journey seemed long to Elizabeth, because Sir William and Maria had nothing to say worth hearing. But when the coach arrived at the Gardiner's house at lunchtime, Elizabeth was delighted to see that her sister looked as healthy and lovely as before. In a private conversation with her aunt later, however, Elizabeth discovered that Jane had been suffering from periods of depression, although she always tried bravely to appear cheerful. The afternoon and evening passed only too quickly, and the next day Elizabeth and the other travellers set off again. When the coach arrived in Hunsford, they were all quite excited to see on one side of the road Lady Catherine's great park, which they had heard so much about. At last, on the other side, they came to the rectory, where they were warmly welcomed by Mr. Collins and Charlotte. Elizabeth was more and more pleased she had come when she found herself so affectionately received. She saw instantly that marriage had not changed her cousin's manners. He insisted on greeting them all with formal politeness and long speeches, and showed them round the house, explaining its many good points in exhausting detail. Elizabeth could not help thinking that perhaps he was speaking particularly to her, as if wishing to make her feel what she had lost in refusing him. But although everything seemed neat and comfortable, she was unable to please him with a sigh of regret. In fact, she wondered how Charlotte could look so cheerful with such a companion. But whenever Mr. Collins said anything of which his wife might be ashamed, which was quite often, Charlotte wisely did not appear to be listening. And when Mr. Collins showed them proudly round his garden, in which he himself enjoyed working, Elizabeth admired the serious way in which Charlotte praised gardening as a most healthy exercise, and admitted encouraging her husband to work outdoors as much as possible. Elizabeth had to confess to herself that, surprisingly, Charlotte really appeared to be happy. When Mr. Collins could be forgotten, the house seemed very pleasant and comfortable, and from Charlotte's evident enjoyment of her home, Elizabeth supposed he must often be forgotten. The visitors had only been in the house for a day, when a message came from Lady Catherine, inviting them all to dinner at Rosings Park the next day. Mr. Collins was delighted, and congratulated his guests on their good luck. "I confess that I might have expected her ladyship to invite us all to drink tea at Rosings on Sunday," he said, "but to invite the whole party to dinner so soon after your arrival, too. What a generous and considerate lady she is." The whole of the rest of that day and the next morning was spent discussing their visit to Rosings. This made Sir William and Maria quite nervous when the moment came to walk across the park and enter the great lady's house. Elizabeth, however, was unimpressed by what she had heard of Lady Catherine, and remained calm. She was interested to see that Lady Catherine was a tall, large woman, who held herself stiffly and proudly, and received her guests with an air of disdain. She spoke loudly and decidedly on every matter, and was clearly convinced of her superiority over other people. Her daughter Anne was completely different, a small, thin, ill-looking lady, who spoke very little, and only in a whisper. The dinner was very good, and was highly praised by Mr. Collins. His repeated compliments, which Elizabeth thought were embarrassing, appeared to please Lady Catherine very much. After dinner, her ladyship talked continuously, giving her opinions without any fear of contradiction or even comment. She then asked Elizabeth many detailed questions about her education, her sisters, and her father's income. Although Elizabeth considered these questions extremely personal and almost rude, she answered them politely and calmly. At the end of the long evening, the visitors were driven home in Lady Catherine's carriage, while Mr. Collins praised his patron for her elegance, intelligence, and hospitality. This visit was repeated twice a week, but there was little other entertainment in Hunsford. Elizabeth had pleasant conversations with Charlotte, or read books, or walked along a narrow path by Lady Catherine's park, which no one else seemed to use. It was a quiet life, but she was satisfied with it. However, 2 weeks after her arrival in Hunsford, she heard that some visitors were coming to stay at Rosings. Lady Catherine's nephew, Mr. Darcy, was expected soon, accompanied by his cousin, Colonel Fitzwilliam. The next day, the 2 gentlemen arrived, and came almost immediately to the rectory. Colonel Fitzwilliam was about 30, not handsome, but very gentlemanly, and he talked pleasantly to the ladies. But Mr. Darcy looked as cold and proud as ever, and after greeting Mrs. Collins, spoke only a few stiffly polite words to Elizabeth. She took the opportunity of asking him if he had by any chance seen Jane in London recently, and thought he looked a little confused when he answered that he had not had that pleasure. Soon after that, the 2 gentlemen returned to Rosings. Colonel Fitzwilliam's manners were very much admired by the ladies, who felt that he would add considerably to the enjoyment of their evenings at Rosings. But it was not until Easter Day that they received an invitation from Lady Catherine, and when they arrived in her sitting-room, it was clear that she was far more interested in her nephews than in her other guests. Colonel Fitzwilliam, however, seemed really glad to see them, and he came at once to sit beside Elizabeth. They talked so agreeably and amusingly together that Mr. Darcy turned his eyes towards them and looked curiously at them several times. When her ladyship also noticed, she called loudly across the room, "Fitzwilliam, what are you talking about with Miss Bennet? Let me hear what it is." "We're speaking of music, madam," he said, when no longer able to avoid a reply. "Of music? Then please speak to all of us. I must have my share in the conversation if you are speaking of music. There are few people in England, I suppose, who have more true enjoyment of music than myself, or a better natural taste. If I had ever learned to play, I would have been a great musician. But I often tell young ladies practice is very important. I have told Miss Bennet several times that she will never play really well unless she practices more, and she is very welcome to come to Rosings and practice on the piano in the servants' hall. She won't be in anyone's way there, I can promise her." Mr. Darcy looked a little ashamed of his aunt's insensitive words. Meanwhile, Colonel Fitzwilliam had persuaded Elizabeth to play some music, and she sat down at the piano. But when she had started playing, Mr. Darcy went to stand in front of the piano where he had a good view of her face. At the end of her first piece of music, Elizabeth said, smiling, "You intend to frighten me, Mr. Darcy, by coming to listen to me, but I'm obstinate and won't be frightened." "I don't think you really believe I intend to alarm you, and I've had the pleasure of knowing you long enough to be aware that you occasionally enjoy stating opinions which are not your own." Elizabeth laughed at this picture of herself, and said to Colonel Fitzwilliam, "Your cousin will teach you not to believe a word I say. Indeed, Mr. Darcy, it is very ungenerous of you to mention all my faults, and perhaps rather foolish too, because I may take my revenge, and tell things about you which your relations will be shocked to hear." "I am not afraid of you," said Darcy, smiling. "But let me hear your accusation," cried Colonel Fitzwilliam. "I'd like to hear how he behaves among strangers." "Well, prepare yourself for something very dreadful. The first time I ever saw him was at a ball in Hertfordshire. And at this ball, what do you think he did? He danced only 4 dances. I'm sorry to cause you pain, but that is what happened. He danced only 4 dances, although gentlemen were scarce, and to my certain knowledge, more than one young lady was sitting down waiting for a partner. Mr. Darcy, you must admit it." I had not, at that time, the honour of knowing anybody at the ball apart from my own group of friends. I should perhaps have asked to be introduced, but I do not like to recommend myself to strangers. I do not find it easy to talk to people I don't know." "You don't want to take the trouble to do it, Darcy, that's why," said Colonel Fitzwilliam.
"I cannot play this piano as well as some other women," said Elizabeth, "but I've always assumed it is my own fault, because I don't take the trouble to practice. I know that I am capable of playing as well as anyone."
Darcy smiled and said, "You are perfectly right. You have spent your time in a much better way. No one who hears you could imagine any possible improvement. We neither of us perform to strangers."
Just then Lady Catherine interrupted them to comment on Elizabeth's playing.
"Miss Bennet would play quite well if she had a London teacher. Of course, Anne would have been a delightful performer if her health had allowed her to learn."
Elizabeth looked at Darcy to see his reaction to Anne de Bourgh's name. But neither at that moment, nor at any other, could she observe any sign of love or even interest in his cousin. Lady Catherine continued to give Miss Bennet advice on her playing, but at the request of the gentleman, Elizabeth stayed at the piano for the rest of the evening.